Hey everybody, this is the final section of Peter Drucker's Max Shachtman is Left. It's titled Conclusion. Of all the outrages against which Shachtman fulminated during a half-century well-stocked with outrages, the Moscow purge trials of the late 1930s probably horrified him most. That Stalin was capable of great crimes did not shock Shachtman too much. He had been indicting Stalin for his crimes for a decade. That the Russian Revolution, the inspiration of his youth and an ideal Shachtman was never able to renounce or replace, should have ended in bloody counter-revolution was not too great a surprise. He always said that the Bolsheviks held the power in their communist vision much longer than anyone would have predicted. But he could not stomach the fact that of all those revolutionaries who had made up the Bolshevik leadership, led the revolution, and been Lenin's and Trotsky's companions, only a handful stayed true to their vision and preserved their honor. The bureaucrats who supported Stalin and did his dirty work were the least of Shachtman's problems. Shachtman was not prepared to see so many of the highest-ranking Bolsheviks, men who had towered over U.S. communists like him in the 1920s, surrender to Stalin, mouth the lines Stalin's flunkies wrote for them, and degrade themselves with abject repeated self-denunciations. Shachtman had known that each of these men had his weaknesses. Somehow in the years of the Bolsheviks' triumph, their weaknesses seemed unimportant, their strengths almost superhuman. Now their strengths were apparently of no use to them or anybody else. Their weaknesses were magnified until these once impressive leaders seemed no longer superhuman, but subhuman, groveling and pathetic. The grinding up of these people impressed Shachtman with the insignificance of individuals within a history that human beings had not yet managed to understand or control. Marx had said a century earlier, quote, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please," end quote. In 1937, Shachtman expanded on Marx's remark, stressing the strength of history's power over individuals. Quote, "While men do make their own history, a multitude of forces combine to produce the great man of each period, and the agglomeration of men not quite so great who compose the general staff. For a period of progress, history needs its leaders. Out of one batch of dough, for a period of reaction, a dough of very different ingredients is used." End quote. The Moscow defendants were destroyed in part because they lost the dynamic connection to working people's movements on which all socialists rely. They were major historical figures when they were leaders of movements around the world and enemies of almost every existing government. When the revolutionary movement died down, they were caught between their distaste at what the communist movement had become and their reluctance to break with it. They were leaders of nothing, involved in nothing, clear about nothing. They seemed insignificant and pitiable. Shachtman's own peculiar transformation obeyed a similar logic. Shachtman was not the great man of any period, but in the ranks of those who built a revolutionary left in the United States in the 1920s and then tried to salvage it from its Stalinist corruption in the 1930s and 1940s, Shachtman was a major leader. Shachtman had a comprehensive knowledge of Marxism's history and theory and a keen feel for its democratic essence. No one felt more at home with Marxists in Europe or Latin America or Asia or better understood the importance of an international movement of U.S. radicals. No one expressed more eloquently the extent of the tragedy the international left went through in those years, whether its activists were being killed by the Kuomintang in China, the Gestapo in Germany, the GPU in the USSR, or the Marines in Central America. He was a creative and original thinker during the years he took part in working class fights, from Minneapolis in 1934 to Grand Rapids in 1944, and felt an intense solidarity with all those fighting to defeat fascism, win leadership away from communism, and transform society after the war. He made a substantial contribution to foreseeing the shape of the post-war world and adapting socialist strategy to it. We can say of him, as he said of the communists of the 1920s, that he was, quote, "painfully beginning to make a rounded conception and practice of revolutionary Marxism, a political force in this country, and who had ever done it before," end quote. For a few years in the 1940s, Shachtman made one original contribution to Marxist theory and politics after another. The theory of bureaucratic collectivism Shachtman developed in 1940 and 41 was only one highlight. There was also his vision of U.S. post-war U.S. world supremacy and his strategy to fight it, his conception of the Third Camp and the Third Camp struggle for national liberation and democracy, Shachtman's explanation of the dual character of communist parties, which made possible his clear-sighted opposition to the post-war Stalinization of Eastern Europe, Shachtman's exposition of radical trade union tactics, particularly in his support for the United Auto Workers Rank-and-File Caucus in 1944 and the GM program in 1946, and his theory of the all-inclusive Revolutionary Party and its cadre. Each of these contributions was a breakthrough that has meaning for socialists today. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, however, Shachtman's ties to labor's rank and file loosened. In the years that followed, he gradually ceased to expect that rank and file working people, whether in U.S. unions or third world countries, would soon speak, act, and take power for themselves. Shachtman came to see socialism as a prospect for a future century, not his own. In his own time, Shachtman decided, trade unions and social democratic leaders would have to act as custodians for the social gains and democratic freedoms that the working class had won. The custodians, in turn, would have to rely on the U.S. government for protection. Many radicals' admiration for Shachtman's clear-sighted condemnation of the Soviet subjugation of Eastern Europe was dismissed, then obliterated, as his opposition to U.S. power faded. Many were shocked when Shachtman condoned the U.S.-sponsored invasion of Cuba in 1961 and opposed U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam. In the end, most radicals felt that Shachtman had failed what Shachtman himself had called the, quote, real test of the American revolutionists, end quote. Not, quote, opposition to British, French, or German capitalisms or even to Stalinism, but to the ruling class and its social system in the United States, end quote. As Shachtman's left and his world were destroyed, Shachtman's wit seemed gradually more defensive, his loyalties more sentimental or vindictive, his historical and theoretical erudition more tendentiously exploited. Shachtman's intelligence became ingenuity in rationalizing the decisions that governments would have made anyway. His confidence in his judgment became virtual indifference to others' opinions. Like other socialists of his time, Shachtman learned little from the feminist movement's insistence that less intellectual, less articulate, less definite people also deserve to be heard. Shachtman and the men he influenced were preoccupied with not being, quote, soft, end quote, not giving an inch to a political opponent because of any personal feeling. As for his eagerness to play an active role in history, it helped ensure that Shachtman would journey all the way from the camp of anti-capitalist revolution to the camp of counter-revolution, the one he backed in Vietnam. He would not stop somewhere in the middle, as did his former comrades who rejected the revolutions in progress but stopped short of supporting the suppression of these revolutions by U.S. troops. If he would not be with the guerrillas who were making anti-capitalist revolutions in the Third World, then he would be with the Cold Warriors who were opposing revolutions in the name of the labor movement. Since Shachtman could not find a viable force in the labor movement of the 1950s that was more progressive than Walter Reuther's United Auto Workers leadership, Shachtman let loyalty to Reuther pull Shachtman toward international social democracy and accommodation to the Cold War. And since Shachtman could not find a force in the labor movement of the 1960s that was more powerful than George Meany's AFL-CIO leadership, Shachtman let loyalty to Meany pull him into support for the U.S. war in Vietnam. One theoretical expression of his evolution was the theory he began developing in late 1945, namely that new bureaucratic ruling classes were being secreted from the pores of decaying capitalism. This theory went together with an underestimation of capitalism's strength and of social democrats' attachment to preserving capitalism. It accelerated his re-examination and rejection of his earlier theoretical work. One after the other, he discarded his earlier theoretical achievements. He had been an eloquent defender of the Russian Revolution for 30 years, but by the early 1950s, Shachtman concluded that the Bolsheviks' effort to build socialism in backward Russia had always been doomed to failure. Shachtman had been a pioneer in linking national liberation to socialism in the Third World, but by the early 1950s, Shachtman concluded that socialism in the Third World would have to wait on socialist transformations elsewhere. Shachtman had explained and predicted Western communist acquiescence in capitalism after the Second World War, but by the late 1940s, Shachtman was warning against communist takeovers in the West that would never come. Shachtman had helped create rank-and-file power in the unions, but by the early 1950s, the unions were reduced in his thinking to the, quote, politically active officialdom, end quote. Shachtman had built his Workers' Party into an organization where discussion was continuous, free-flowing, and channeling into collective action. By the late 1950s, he had dissolved it. Shachtman's most enduring legacy, one that all his followers of whatever tendency would continue to affirm after Shachtman's death, was Shachtman's appreciation of the inseparability of socialism and democracy. All democratic socialists can rely on his arguments that democratic freedoms and democratic institutions are indispensable to working people who seek to rule and transform society. But even his commitments to democracy changed shape in his last years. He had once criticized U.S. democracy by the standard of the more thoroughgoing, substantive democracy of the Russian Soviets and Catalan workers' juntas. He ended by explaining the importance of the crumbs of democracy that existed under the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese regime. The contract between capitalist democracy and socialist democracy faded from his thoughts. Of the socialists who spoke at his memorial service, not one mentioned the concept of the, quote, third camp, end quote, that had been his lodestar. Shachtman's orientation to the AFL-CIO did enable him in the mid-1960s to build an alliance between unions and civil rights organizations and to help shape some major Great Society social programs, but in other ways it impelled Shachtman to rein in his own radical impulses even on U.S. domestic issues. Shachtman subordinated the demands of the civil rights movement to the electoral needs of the Democratic Party. To the extent that there were any stirrings of rank-and-file activism in the unions, he opposed or ignored them. Sometimes in his last years, Shachtman seemed to sense that there had been something finer in his politics in the 1930s and 1940s than in the 1960s. Quote, many thousands of old radicals like myself vote for the goddamn Democrats, end quote. Shachtman said, quote, and yet as I look back on that decade, the 30s, it was for radicals the most exciting period in American history, end quote. The excitement Shachtman remembered from the 1930s and early 1940s was the excitement of confrontation, not only confrontation between left and right, labor and capital, but between two different visions of what, quote, America, end quote, should be. The excitement came from believing that the United States might become truly his country, a country where an immigrant Jewish Marxist from Harlem could feel fully at home. He believed that his ideals could become the common property of his people. He believed that the unskilled immigrants joining the CIO, the African Americans coming north to work in factories, the rebels against U.S. colonialism in the Philippines, and the heirs of dead Sacco and Vanzetti would be won to his side. He believed that the most powerful capitalist country, the, quote, arsenal of world reaction, end quote, could become, quote, the living vindication of Marxism, end quote, and an ally of peoples fighting for freedom. Instead of holding on his last 2 decades to his original vision of what the United States could be, Shachtman convinced himself that a simulacrum of his vision had already been created. Shachtman convinced himself that the AFL-CIO was almost a mass socialist movement, that the Democratic Party was almost a labor party, that Johnson's Great Society had almost made African Americans equal, that the United States had almost saved Vietnam for democracy. Shachtman convinced himself that a group of trade union officials incarnated the working class community into which he had been born, to which he had been once been loyal in reality, and to which he was still loyal in imagination. Shachtman's adversaries and disillusioned followers sometimes trivialized his tragedy by denying any continuity between his achievements and his end. One Trotskyist said that he died, quote, a firm supporter of the capitalist system, end quote. Julius Jacobson called him a man who had already died his, quote, moral and political death, end quote, a, quote, renegade, end quote, from, quote, his earlier most fundamental commitment to social justice, end quote. He added, quote, to say that he died in any sense at all as socialist is to denude the word of all meaning, end quote. These comments fail to fully express the paradox of Shachtman's last years. Shachtman moved far to the right, but he kept trying to rebuild a socialist movement. Cut off from the rank and file of the labor movement, Shachtman kept trying to mend the broken thread that had once tied his politics to the U.S. working class. Straining to reach the thread's lost end, Shachtman went rightward to where he imagined it was lying. No U.S. socialist has managed to mend that thread, but glimmerings of a new radical mood in U.S. labor in the 1980s and 1990s suggest where the lost end might be picked up. It might be where Shachtman saw it in 1938. Among those who feel connections between their lives here and working people's lives in Latin America, the Philippines, South Africa, and they recognize the corporate employers they hate as the same ones hated in Southeast Asia and Europe. These working people and today's socialists may meet on a trail that Shachtman helped blaze. And that's the end of the conclusion. And also, that's the end of the book. I want you to know that I read 200 pages of this book in 24 hours. So I'm fried. Thanks for listening.